Hey everyone, this is Miss Moriarty, and I'm here to discuss with us our concept number 3 of our ecology unit, and that is how energy flows through ecosystems. So, when we talk about energy flowing through ecosystems, we usually always start at the very source, right? So, the ultimate source of energy on Earth is considered the sun in this case. But how do we get that energy? Right? Because remember, as consumers, right, as animals, we don't necessarily have the ability to just sit out in the sun and capture energy. So, what must come first? So, ways in which organisms get energy is typically through producers. Because producers can produce their own food, we can also call them autotrophs. Autotrophs can actually obtain energy from non living sources, such as the sun, carbon, or water. Because remember, those three ingredients or reactants is what helps to then create photosynthesis. Right? Thinking back to towards the beginning of the year, remember we talked about how photosynthesis is the reaction that plants perform when CO2, H2O, and sunlight react to form simple sugars like glucose as well as oxygen gas. Some examples of organisms that perform photosynthesis would be things like plants, some bacteria, as well as algae found in the ocean. Now, other ways, right? Because not all organisms are obviously producers. There are things such as consumers. These organisms are called heterotrophs, and so this means we must obtain energy from other living organisms or once living organisms. Who would be considered consumers? All animals, most bacteria, as well as fungi. So let's take a closer look at our producers and how they may obtain energy. So there are two different ways in which producers can obtain energy. One is through photosynthesis, which we are very familiar with, while the other is called chemosynthesis. In photosynthesis, we know that the source of energy in this case is sunlight. Organisms like plants and cyanobacteria can capture that sunlight and turn it into glucose. And we know that they do that by using six CO2 molecules, six H2O, to create glucose, C6H12O6, and our byproduct is six oxygen molecules. Now, another way in which other producers can obtain energy is through chemosynthesis. So, that prefix chemo actually refers to using chemicals like sulfur or methane. So, these kinds of producers don't have sunlight energy as a readily available source. And so, what kind of organisms might perform chemosynthesis? Typically, it's bacteria found in the depths of the ocean and where sunlight does not reach. What does the reaction look like in chemosynthesis? Kind of similar to our photosynthesis reaction. CO2 is still required, but remember in this case, we're going to use other chemicals like sulfur and methane and not sunlight. Um, but in the end, we do still produce glucose as our main output. Now, how consumers get their energy? We know consumers must eat other organisms, which is why we are classified as heterotrophs. And what we do is we break down the carbohydrates that plants produce. And thinking back to when we talked about photosynthesis and cell respiration, we know that plants produce that carbohydrate, and that sunlight energy is then going to be trapped within the molecules of glucose. And how we get that energy is by breaking those bonds, changing that energy into a form our cells can use, which is known as ATP. The process that does this is cellular respiration, which takes place in the mitochondria of each of our cells. Now, there are four types of consumers that we might see in an ecosystem. One of them are herbivores, and we know that herbivores tend to only eat vegetation, while carnivores only eat meat. Some species can be considered omnivores, which means they eat both meat and vegetation, while others are called detritivores or decomposers. These organisms are really important in maintaining the stability of the ecosystem because they help to break down dead material and put it typically back into the ecosystem to be reused. Now, within an ecosystem, we tend to create these things called food chains, which are linear models showing us how energy may flow from what's called one trophic level to the next trophic level. So notice how the arrows drawn from the grass to the grasshopper to the mouse and to the owl indicate the flow of energy. Now, how do we calculate how much energy is available at each trophic level? We use something called the rule of 10. As energy flows from one organism to another, that energy is going to be used for metabolism, right? All the reactions that take place in that organism in order to survive. It will also be converted to then heat. So, what does the rule of 10 actually mean? Well, when we go from the, say, grass to the grasshopper, only about 10% of the energy is going to be transferred from our grass to our grasshopper, while 90% of the energy will be lost as heat. And so here, looking at our trophic levels, the very first one is our producer level. These are the organisms that are autotrophs. They can make their own food, they capture sunlight directly, um, and change that into simple sugars. Now, what consumes the grass? What would we call the grasshopper in this case? They would be the first consumer in this food chain. So we call them a primary consumer. The mouse, in this case, would be called the secondary consumer, followed by the owl, which would be the tertiary consumer. So in this case, there were four trophic levels: one, two, three, four within our food chain. First always comes our producers, followed by the primary consumer, secondary, and the tertiary consumer. And don't forget, remember, the arrows and their direction is what indicates the energy flow. So, could you classify each types of these consumers by what they consume? Remember, here our grasshopper is only consuming grass. So in this case, that would make them a herbivore. Here our mouse is consuming our grasshopper. In this case, that would make them a carnivore. Our owl is consuming our mouse. That would make the owl also a carnivore. Now, food chains aren't really realistic in ecosystems. What is a better depiction of how we see energy flow in an ecosystem is through what's called a food web. So these show multiple food chains at once and how they may be interconnected. And don't forget, the direction of the arrows is what's showing us the energy flow through this food web. Now, there's actually a very specific shape that we tend to use to indicate a couple things about an ecosystem and its food web. So, we use these things called trophic pyramids that help us show how energy may flow through ecosystems and how much available energy they may be at each trophic level. So, our energy pyramid represents the energy available at each trophic level, and it always gets smaller as you go up the pyramid. Because thinking back to our rule of 10, only 10% of the energy gets passed along. We can actually use that same shape to represent the number of organisms at each trophic level. Since energy tends to decrease the higher up you go on the pyramid, fewer organisms can be supported in that ecosystem, which is why we tend to see tons and tons of grass versus the amount of owls. We can also use our pyramid shape to indicate the total mass of living organic matter at each trophic level as well. And that would be classified as the biomass. So here in the very last slide, I'd like you to take a second and pause this video and see if you can indicate the trophic level numbers, names, and percent of energy available at each trophic level in your note packet. Okay, at this point, you should have indicated each of these items, so let's go over it. So remember, at the very bottom or base of our pyramid are our producers, right? They are going to be level number 1, followed by grasshopper 2, mouse 3, and owl 4, since we have 4 trophic levels. Here we know our grasses are considered producers or autotrophs. Our grasshopper would be a primary consumer, mouse would be a secondary consumer, and our owl would be a tertiary consumer. How much available energy would be at each trophic level? Well, we know our producers capture sunlight energy directly, and we know that they are the base of the pyramid, so they're going to have the most available energy. So they're going to have 100% of that energy. As we move up to the grasshopper level, only 10% will be passed along. And so that grasshopper will only be obtaining about 10% of the energy. The mouse, however, will only be obtaining about 1%, while the owl, 0.1%. So that's important to note. Remember, as we move up the energy pyramid, we see less and less energy available, which means we're going to see less and less owls compared to, say, grass or grasshoppers. We also see less biomass available in the ecosystem at that top level than we do at the very bottom or base. Okay, everyone, that is it for our video today. Make sure as you watch the video, you took notes, and please be ready to discuss in class.